The bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Fourth Amendment guarantees all Americans the right to be free of unreasonable government searches and seizures. Currently, the laws governing the Fourth Amendment are not necessarily being applied in certain digital contexts, and courts do not consider searches of database that have been acquired through purchase as requiring warrants. The key legislation in this space is the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, which was written in 1986 and did not take into account all the advances in digital communication that have occurred since that time. It is therefore necessary to do our job to update key tenets of privacy law. This bill would prevent federal agencies' further abuse of this loophole. Rather than obtaining a warrant, as they would be required to for a wiretap of a phone call, government agencies such as the FBI, IRS, DEA, DHS, and others have begun buying data from data brokers to increase large amounts of Americans' data and then search them with no warrant. In one example, the CDC paid $420,000 to purchase location data during the pandemic to determine whether Americans were going to church, visiting their neighbors, or otherwise abiding by the government's arbitrary social distancing laws. This bill will prohibit the government's purchase of this data that includes private personal information like location information, online data, health information, etc. It will also require the government to get a court order to force data brokers to disclose data, treating these cases more like traditional phone wiretaps. The committee has in recent years passed major reforms to overhaul the ECPA, but those bills have never made it into law. It's time to finally move major legislation to protect privacy, and this bill is exactly the type of legislation needed to rein in the federal government and protect the privacy rights of Americans. Data brokers are selling Americans' personal information to law enforcement and intelligence agencies, which are then being searched without warrants and without oversight, in contrast to strict rules that prevent phone companies and social media sites from selling such information to the government. This is Congress's job to update the law and fill in gaps that arise over time. We must act today to pass this bill and end the government's ability to avoid the Fourth Amendment by purchasing your highly sensitive information from data brokers and then ultimately using it against you. The Fourth Amendment is Not for Sale Act would close this legal loophole and is a critical step in limiting the federal government's warrantless surveillance of Americans. I am appreciative of those on the other side of the aisle who are co-sponsoring this important piece of legislation. I look forward to bipartisan support for this now and on the floor, and I appreciate everyone who's worked on this. And I ask again that all of us come together to fortify the Fourth Amendment and support this legislation. And before I yield back, Mr. Chairman, I just want to point out a few other things. The U.S. government buys data on American with little oversight report finds. So I have a series of articles I would like to submit for the record. One is CDC tracked millions of phones to see if Americans followed COVID lockdown orders. Another is a letter by Senator Ron Johnson to Dr. Walensky, director of the CDC. The FBI an article titled, "The FBI just admitted it bought U.S. location data." I'd like to submit those for the record, please. Thank you. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, the ranking member, Mr. Nadler, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 4639, the Fourth Amendment is Not for Sale Act, is strong bipartisan legislation that would prevent government overreach by prohibiting the warrantless purchase of customer data. We are living through an information technology revolution. Email, social media, smartphones, and laptops have transformed our lives over the last 20 years. This technology is not going anywhere, and we do not want it to. But these incredible new technologies have also raised privacy concerns that could not have been imagined when the laws governing them were put into place. One of the chief privacy concerns behind this new technology involves the sale and acquisition of data. When you do anything that involves the internet, you leave a breadcrumb trail of data behind. This generates a substantial amount of personal information that most of us would like to keep private. Certainly we would like to keep it private from companies, but we especially would like to keep our online habits private from our own government. Every person sitting in this room today likely has a cell phone with them. Our lives have moved online, and our digital footprints are constantly being swept up by internet companies who can sell the information for commercial use in micro-targeted advertisements or the compilation of complex digital profiles. Dating websites, mobile prayer apps, and other companies that deal in our personally sensitive information are often free to collect and sell data on our precise location, who we love, or how we worship. And although some companies claim to sell only de-identified data or to never sell it to the government, experts agree that there's just one problem. These claims are not remotely true. Data brokers can re-identify anonymous data, knowing whose data they are looking at, and in many cases, a person's location in real time, with just a few pieces of so-called de-identified data. This loss of anonymity is a problem for all kinds of reasons, but it is especially troubling when that data is being bought and used by the FBI and other law enforcement agencies. While we do not have access to the full picture of law enforcement data access, some government contracts can give us a sense of scale. ICE, DEA, and the FBI, among other agencies, all contract with a data broker that sources location data from over 80,000 apps and is so precise that officers can track individuals within specific homes and businesses. Government agents use data products to track suspects, facilitate deportations, and even monitor for potential crimes. Even more worryingly, integrated personal profiles offered by data brokers are also used to supplement controversial predictive policing technologies and surveillance mechanisms, such as facial recognition software and gunshot detection, posing further risk to our civil rights and civil liberties. We have the Fourth Amendment for a reason. If law enforcement wants to gather information about you, they should need a warrant for that. They should have to go to a judge and explain why there is probable cause and why they need to know this information. But when federal law enforcement purchases this data, they can bypass our judicial system entirely. They just need to go to the cloud. Our current state of affairs is clearly not what our founders intended. Our right to privacy is being abrogated every day by those whose job it is to keep us safe. The Fourth Amendment is not for sale act would change that. Under this legislation, government agencies would no longer be able to exchange anything of value for customer data. Moreover, it would also prohibit law enforcement agencies from seeking to circumvent these requirements by stopping third-party disclosure of data to law enforcement and interagency data sharing, among other provisions. I was proud to introduce this legislation in the last Congress, and I am pleased to be the lead Democratic co-sponsor this Congress. I thank the chairman for bringing it up before the committee. I urge all members to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. I would just add, if we remember from the hearing last week when the director of the FBI was asked, I believe by Ms. Jayapal and I think a second colleague of ours from the Democrat side, about this very issue. Is the FBI purchasing Americans' data from brokers and private data? His response on both occasions, if I remember correctly, was, I'll have to get back with you and give you a briefing. So this is as timely as it comes. This is a great piece of legislation, and I appreciate the bipartisan support we are getting for it. Who seeks recognition?
I seek recognition.
The gentleman from Florida, and then the gentlelady from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.